Have you ever walked into a place for the very first time, yet something deep inside you whispered you'd been there before? Or maybe you met someone new, and an instant, powerful connection washed over you, a sense of familiarity so strong it sent shivers down your spine. Have you woken from a dream, your heart pounding, images of a life you never lived clinging to your mind with haunting intensity? Most of us brush these moments aside, labeling them as odd coincidences or tricks of the mind. But what if they're not? What if they're fragments of a hidden past, the echo of lives you once lived, quietly leaking into the person you are today? Across centuries, Buddhist masters have taught that who we think we are is just one ripple in a vast ocean of consciousness, shaped by countless lifetimes stretching far beyond the horizon of memory. Yet modern life makes it easy to forget this profound truth. We rush from one task to the next, consumed by endless worries, barely pausing to wonder, where do these deep-seated fears, inexplicable talents, or strange longings truly come from? Tonight, we journey into the heart of this question. We'll explore powerful signs that your soul has already traveled this world many times before, signs that hide in plain sight, waiting for you to recognize them. We'll share true stories of children who recalled lives they never lived, tales of instant recognition between strangers who seem bound by an invisible thread, and glimpses into the science that's challenging what we thought we knew about consciousness. But this isn't just about curiosity or mystery. It's about liberation. Because understanding your soul's longer journey can free you from fears that don't belong to this life, heal wounds that have festered for centuries, and awaken a compassion so deep it transcends your own lifetime. Imagine living each day with the quiet strength that comes from knowing you are far more than this moment, this name, this single identity. So stay with us. As we peel back the layers of your present reality, you may discover that what you've always suspected deep down, that you are part of something timeless, was true all along. The path ahead is filled with astonishing discoveries, stories that will stir your heart, and questions that could forever change the way you see yourself and everyone around you. And it all begins by opening your mind to the possibility that who you are did not start with your birth, nor will it end with your death. Before we can truly recognize the signs that we've lived before, it's important to clear up a common misunderstanding about what rebirth really means in Buddhism. Many people imagine it like a soul or spirit jumping neatly from one body into another, carrying a complete personality from one life to the next. But Buddhist teachings reveal something much subtler and far more profound. In the Buddha's insight, there is no eternal, unchanging self drifting between bodies like a traveler switching vehicles. Instead, consciousness is a flowing, dynamic process, shaped by every thought, word, and deed across time. Karma, the accumulation of our intentions and actions, acts like a current, guiding this stream of consciousness to new forms of existence. So it's not that you, in the exact sense of your current identity, reincarnate, but rather that your mental imprints, your tendencies, and unresolved patterns continue their journey. One of the most powerful images used by Buddhist masters is that of lighting one candle from another. The second flame is not identical to the first, but there is a clear and direct connection. One causes the other to arise. Just like that, our present consciousness springs from past causes. Nothing is born out of nothing. The Buddha described this as dependent origination. Everything arises in dependence on conditions. On the night of his enlightenment, the Buddha experienced countless past lives, not as abstract concepts but as vivid memories. He saw himself born as humans of every class, as animals, even as beings in heavenly and hellish realms. Each life, he realized, was linked by karma in an intricate web of cause and effect, a continuous process of becoming. This understanding wasn't meant to inspire fear or resignation, but rather to show the way to freedom. When you see clearly that every thought and deed leaves a trace, you become empowered to transform your future. Every act of kindness plants seeds for peace. Every act of harm plants seeds for suffering, rippling out beyond this single lifetime. Today, this perspective remains revolutionary. In a world obsessed with instant gratification and short-term thinking, knowing that your actions have consequences reaching far beyond this life can shift your entire approach to living. Those stubborn patterns you can't explain, the fears that don't match anything in your childhood, the talents that feel like old friends returning, all of these may carry the fingerprints of your earlier journeys through existence. Understanding rebirth in this way also invites a deep sense of humility and compassion. Realizing that others are not strangers but fellow travelers on the same long path can soften judgment and open the heart. You may find that someone who tests your patience could have been your companion in another life. The child you comfort today could have been your parent in a previous existence. Every encounter holds the potential for healing ancient wounds and deepening timeless bonds. Every moment offers the chance to sow seeds of peace that will blossom long after this body has returned to dust. And when we look at the mysterious stories of people who seem to remember lives they never lived, when children describe events and places they've never seen with impossible accuracy, or when deep déjà vu pierces the veil of what we think we know, these experiences begin to make more sense. They remind us that life is not a single chapter, but a vast, unfolding saga of consciousness, stretching far beyond what we can remember. For many people, the idea of past lives sounds like something belonging only to myths or religious stories. But scattered across the world are thousands of documented cases, suggesting that the memories of previous existences are not just ancient legends. They may be a real phenomenon that science is only beginning to grapple with. Consider the remarkable work of Dr. Ian Stevenson, a psychiatrist who dedicated decades to investigating children who spontaneously recalled details of lives they had never lived, names, addresses, events, and even causes of death. He documented over 3,000 such cases, painstakingly verifying historical facts whenever possible. In many instances, children spoke languages they had never heard in their current life or recognized places, and people with uncanny accuracy. Some bore birthmarks or physical deformities matching the fatal wounds of the person they seemed to remember being. These cases are not isolated to one culture or religion. From India and Burma to Turkey and the United States, similar stories unfold. Toddlers who wake screaming from nightmares of battlefields, little ones who speak of families in distant towns, or children who know how to perform skills they've never been taught. The sheer consistency across cultures and the number of verifiable details challenge the idea that these memories are mere coincidence or fantasy. Take, for example, the astonishing case of James Leininger, a boy from Louisiana who began having vivid nightmares about a plane crash when he was just 2 years old. He described being trapped in a burning cockpit, screaming, "Plane on fire. Little man can't get out." His parents were stunned when he identified his plane as a Corsair, named his aircraft carrier as the Natoma Bay, and even recognized fellow pilots from old photos. Historical research confirmed the existence of a WWII pilot named James Huston Jr., who died exactly as the child described, at the precise location he pointed to on a map, Iwo Jima. Or the case of a Tibetan girl who, at age 3, correctly identified objects belonging to a nun who had died years earlier. When tested by monks, She unerringly picked out the deceased nun's personal prayer beads from a mix with identical-looking beads, whispering, "These are mine." She knew secrets no one had told her, information that had never been written down. Even respected scientists have been forced to rethink old assumptions. Dr. Jim Tucker, Stevenson's successor at the University of Virginia, has gathered over 2,500 additional cases. Many of these children begin recalling memories between the ages of 2 and 4, often speaking in detail about events and relationships from lives their families had no connection to. By around age 7, these memories usually fade as the child's mind becomes more fixed in the present life. These findings challenge the conventional view that consciousness is merely a byproduct of the brain. Some neuroscientists and quantum physicists, like Sir Roger Penrose, have speculated that consciousness might exist at a quantum level, capable of surviving the death of the brain itself. If true, this would radically reshape our understanding of life, death, and what it means to be human. Near-death experiences, NDEs, offer further intrigue. People who have clinically died and returned to life often describe similar experiences. A sense of floating above their bodies, moving through a tunnel, and reliving every action they've taken, sometimes with a profound feeling of connection to all beings. These reports bear striking resemblance to Buddhist descriptions of the bardo, the transitional state between death and rebirth, where one reviews past actions before moving on. And yet, despite decades of research, the mystery of consciousness, what philosophers call the hard problem, remains unsolved. How do electrical signals in the brain produce subjective experience? How could memories of lives lived long ago emerge in young children who have never been exposed to those cultures or stories? These questions are no longer confined to monks meditating in mountain monasteries. They are now at the heart of debates among scientists, philosophers, and doctors around the world, pushing us to reconsider the nature of mind, memory, and the continuity of existence. Skeptics will rightly argue for caution. False memories, suggestibility, or coincidences can explain some stories. But when a child recalls dozens of verifiable details about a stranger's life, or speaks a language their family has never encountered, the odds against mere chance grow astronomically. It becomes harder to dismiss the possibility that our consciousness carries echoes from other times, other places, other lives. There's something hauntingly familiar about the way certain fears, dreams, or attractions follow us through life without any clear origin. They appear like whispers from a forgotten story, hinting that what we call the present might just be the latest chapter in a much older tale. Across cultures and centuries, Buddhist teachers and modern researchers alike have noticed patterns that suggest past life memories can seep into our current existence. These 7 signs could reveal that your soul has traveled this world many times before. Unexplained phobias stand out as some of the clearest hints. If you've been terrified of deep water without ever having a bad swimming experience, or felt paralyzing fear of heights despite never falling, these instinctive reactions may be karmic imprints left from how you died in a previous life. Ancient Tibetan texts describe how the powerful emotions experienced at the moment of death can leave deep marks on consciousness, reappearing as phobias in a new body. Recurring dreams where you're someone completely different also carry clues. These aren't ordinary, forgettable dreams. They're vivid, emotionally intense, and often show you in unfamiliar clothes, speaking a language you've never learned, or living in a time or place you can't explain. Buddhist dream yoga practitioners teach that these dreams can be glimpses through the thin veil separating your current identity from previous ones, especially when the same dream repeats with striking detail. Instant recognition of a stranger can be just as revealing. Meeting someone and feeling like you've known them forever, or feeling sudden, inexplicable aversion, may reflect karmic relationships carried across lifetimes. Buddhist teachings describe how beings can journey together through many rebirths, drawn by deep bonds of love, resentment, or unresolved karma. Such feelings of instant connection often defy logic but resonate with a sense of profound familiarity. Then there's unlearned knowledge or unexpected talents. Perhaps you picked up an instrument for the first time and played like you'd practiced for years, or understood a foreign language you never studied. Stories of prodigies who display extraordinary abilities at a young age may be more than genetic luck. They could be skills cultivated in past existences, seeds planted long ago that bloom again when conditions are right. Déjà vu experiences that go beyond fleeting familiarity can also signal echoes of past lives. Feeling an overwhelming sense you've been somewhere before, especially when visiting a place for the first time, might mean you're brushing against a memory from a previous life. Buddhist texts suggest that powerful experiences from past incarnations can create energetic imprints, which resurface as intense déjà vu when we encounter similar places or situations. Birthmarks or unusual physical traits sometimes carry astonishing connections. Dr. Ian Stevenson documented cases of children whose birthmarks matched wounds or scars from the deaths of people they seem to remember being. While not every birthmark is significant, the alignment of location, shape, and personal memories in some cases challenges our understanding of how consciousness and the body intertwine. Finally, an inexplicable attraction to a particular culture, era, or place can reveal subtle ties to former lives. Feeling unreasonably drawn to ancient Egypt, medieval Japan, or a country you have no family or cultural connection to might mean your consciousness remembers time spent there. This pull can go beyond simple curiosity, manifesting as a deep sense of belonging, nostalgia, or even an unshakable feeling of homecoming when you finally visit. Taken alone, any one of these signs could be coincidence. But when several appear together, unexplained fears, vivid recurring dreams, sudden connections, innate skills, intense déjà vu, birthmarks with meaning, or a powerful draw to certain places. They weave a compelling tapestry suggesting your story didn't start at birth, and it won't end with death. Every sign invites you to look more closely at the mysteries in your own life. Are they random quirks, or could they be quiet echoes from lifetimes past, calling you to remember who you truly are beyond this single moment in time? Few things stir the soul like a true story that defies everything we thought we knew about life and death. Across the world, thousands of cases have surfaced where children and adults recall memories so specific, so verifiable, they challenge even the most skeptical minds. These stories don't just entertain, they open a window into a mystery that has fascinated humanity for millennia. The possibility that our consciousness carries memories across lifetimes. Consider the heartbreaking yet astonishing tale of Shanti Devi, born in Delhi, India, in the 1930s. At just 4 years old, she began telling her parents in detail about a life she claimed to have lived in a town called Mathura, describing her husband, family, and home with astonishing precision. Her knowledge included details her current family couldn't have known, like names of neighbors, specific local landmarks, and even hidden objects inside the house she insisted had been hers. When the adults took her to Mathura, she navigated the town confidently, recognized her previous life husband and son, and pointed out features of the house exactly as they were, stunning everyone who witnessed it. Or the remarkable account of James Leininger, a boy in the United States who, as a toddler, began having horrific nightmares of crashing in a burning plane. He described technical details of WWII fighter planes with shocking accuracy for a 2-year-old. He named his aircraft carrier, Natoma Bay, and the Corsair fighter he flew. He even remembered names of fellow pilots and the exact spot over Iwo Jima where his plane went down. His family's research confirmed the existence of a pilot named James Huston Jr., who died exactly as little James described. None of this information had been shared with him, yet he spoke of it with the conviction of personal experience. Another moving example comes from Tibet, where Buddhist monks have long relied on reincarnation stories to identify the rebirths of spiritual teachers. One such case tells of a young boy who, without prompting, led monks to the hidden possessions of a revered lama who had died years before. He identified objects among dozens of similar items, recognized the lama's old friends, and spoke of private events no one outside the monastery knew. For Tibetan Buddhists, such signs are not simply fascinating. They are considered reliable evidence of a teacher's rebirth, ensuring the continuity of their wisdom. Sometimes, these stories reveal themselves through deep emotional wounds. A girl in Thailand began having intense panic attacks whenever she saw knives. As she learned to speak, she described a violent death in a past life, naming the village and circumstances of her murder. When her family investigated, they discovered the story matched a woman who had died there decades earlier in the exact way the child described, down to the location of the wounds. This child also had birthmarks corresponding to the stab wounds of the deceased woman, a detail eerily consistent with many other documented cases of reincarnation. Western cases are just as compelling. A young boy in Scotland insisted he once lived on a remote island called Barra, describing in detail a white house by the sea, a black and white dog, and the name Shane Robertson. His family traveled to Barra, and there they found a house matching his description, a dog of the breed he'd mentioned, and historical records of a Robertson family living there decades before. The boy's tears of recognition, as he embraced the land he claimed as home, moved even hardened skeptics to silence. These stories share common threads: memories emerging in early childhood, details that match real events, emotions too intense for fantasy, and a fading of memories as children grow older. They raise difficult questions. How could a child know things never taught or mentioned? Why do these memories emerge with such force, then dissipate like morning mist? Could it be that consciousness doesn't start fresh with each birth, but continues its journey carrying echoes of the past into each new life? Every story invites us to open our hearts and minds to the possibility that we are far more than this single lifetime. They suggest our deepest fears and talents may not come from nowhere, but from stories we've lived before, stories that shape the person we become today. For many, the idea of past lives remains a fascinating theory or a distant story, something that happens to others, but never within reach of their own experience. Yet Buddhist masters have long taught that anyone can begin to glimpse the memories hidden deep within their consciousness. With patience, openness, and the right approach, these subtle traces can surface, offering insights that heal old wounds, reveal hidden talents, and inspire profound compassion. One of the simplest and most powerful methods is meditation on karmic patterns. This practice begins by sitting quietly in a space where you feel safe and undisturbed. With your spine straight and your breath steady, allow your mind to settle until your thoughts slow, like silt sinking to the bottom of a still lake. When your awareness grows calm and clear, gently bring to mind a recurring dream, an unexplained fear, or a place or culture you feel deeply drawn to without knowing why. Hold this image softly, without forcing answers, and ask yourself with sincere curiosity, when have I experienced this before? Don't expect dramatic visions right away. Past life memories often emerge as subtle sensations, like a wave of emotion, a sudden image, or a feeling of familiarity that can't be explained by your current life. Another ancient practice involves observing the transition between wakefulness and sleep. In Tibetan Buddhism, this threshold is considered a powerful gateway, similar to the bardo between death and rebirth. As you drift towards sleep, maintain a thin thread of awareness while gently asking your mind to reveal glimpses of previous lives. Keep a journal beside your bed, and upon waking, write down any images, emotions, or fragments you recall. Even fleeting details can, over time, form a mosaic of past life experiences. Guided past life regression, when approached with caution and respect, can also help. This gentle form of hypnosis leads you into a deeply relaxed state, inviting your subconscious mind to trace memories beyond your present lifetime. People often report emerging with vivid impressions, places they've never visited, names or dates they don't consciously know, or strong emotions tied to unfamiliar scenes. While it's important to work with a skilled, ethical guide, these sessions can offer profound glimpses into patterns carried through multiple lives. Yet ancient teachings remind us not all memories are meant to be uncovered. The Buddha taught that certain experiences remain hidden for good reason. They may overwhelm, distract, or cause unnecessary suffering. If fear, resistance, or confusion arises, it's wise to pause and trust your inner sense of readiness. Sometimes, the lesson of a past life is not in remembering every detail, but in understanding the pattern it left behind, and making choices today that free you from its grip. Ultimately, the goal is not to indulge in curiosity for its own sake, but to gain insight into the karmic threads that weave through your existence. By recognizing these patterns, you can heal relationships that feel inexplicably charged, release fears that have lingered without cause, and cultivate a compassion that comes from knowing we all carry old stories beneath the surface. Awareness of past lives doesn't just add chapters to your biography. It deepens your sense of purpose and connection in the life you're living right now. It can awaken gratitude for the precious opportunity each moment holds, and inspire a gentler, wiser way of moving through the world. For those who dare to look beyond the surface of a single lifetime, the memories and impressions of past lives offer far more than stories to satisfy curiosity. They can transform the way we see ourselves and others, freeing us from patterns we've carried unknowingly, and opening the heart to a deeper compassion that spans lifetimes. Understanding that our consciousness may have moved through countless forms helps us see that many struggles aren't confined to this life alone. That unexplained fear of abandonment, the persistent feeling of unworthiness, or the patterns of conflict repeating in relationships, these may not have begun with your childhood. They might have roots in experiences long forgotten by your conscious mind, but etched into your deeper awareness. By recognizing their ancient origins, you gain the power to break cycles that have shaped you for lifetimes, turning pain into wisdom and freedom. Remembering past lives can also shed light on the soul connections we experience. Have you ever met someone and felt an instant bond, as if your souls recognized each other? Or perhaps you felt drawn to a teacher, a friend, or even a stranger in a way that defies explanation. These moments may be echoes of relationships carried across incarnations, unfinished stories of love, support, or lessons yet to be learned. Acknowledging these connections can help heal old wounds and build relationships based on understanding and kindness, instead of unconscious baggage. For many, Glimpses of past lives awaken a profound sense of humility. Realizing you've been rich and poor, strong and weak, noble and cruel across countless lifetimes can dissolve rigid identities and judgments. It invites you to see others not as fixed labels, enemy or friend, successful or failing, but as fellow travelers through many lives, each shaped by their own unseen stories. This perspective naturally gives rise to compassion, patience, and a desire to help rather than harm. Even the way we view death changes. If consciousness continues beyond this body, death loses its finality. It becomes a doorway, a transition to the next chapter, rather than the end of the book. Fear softens into acceptance, and grief can transform into gratitude for the time shared. This perspective can inspire us to live more fully in the present, knowing every moment is precious and every action carries forward into the future, whether in this life or the next. Most importantly, remembering past lives points to the possibility of liberation. The Buddha taught that the cycle of birth and death, Samsara, is marked by suffering as long as we remain bound by ignorance and craving. But by seeing the patterns repeating across lifetimes, we begin to understand how karma works and what binds us. With that insight, we can cultivate the wisdom, compassion, and mindful action that lead to freedom, breaking the cycle at its root. Remembering who we have been isn't about glorifying the past, but about awakening to the timeless truth of who we are now. A consciousness that has traveled far, carrying seeds of every experience, and yet capable in each moment of planting new seeds for peace, kindness, and awakening. As we explore the mystery of past lives, it's easy to become fascinated by who we were and the dramas we once lived. But in the heart of Buddhist teachings lies a reminder. The point isn't to linger in these stories, but to awaken to something far greater, the possibility of freedom from the endless cycle of birth and death itself. This cycle, known as samsara, is not a cosmic punishment, but the natural result of cause and effect, karma, playing out across lifetimes. Every craving, every ignorance, every unskillful action we carry forward seeds another round of suffering. As long as these seeds remain, consciousness continues to spin through rebirth after rebirth, experiencing joy, pain, and everything in between. It's like being caught in a wheel that never stops turning, each lifetime a momentary stop before the next rotation. Yet the Buddha taught that liberation is possible. By seeing through the illusions that bind us, attachment, aversion, and the mistaken belief in a fixed self, we can begin to unravel the patterns that keep us circling in samsara. This awakening doesn't mean erasing the self, but recognizing that what we call I is a temporary combination of causes and conditions, always changing, never truly separate from everything else. When we truly understand this, fear dissolves, greed loses its grip, and hatred gives way to compassion. Meditation is one of the most powerful tools to cultivate this insight. By watching the mind with calm awareness, we see thoughts, feelings, and sensations rise and fall like waves on the ocean. We begin to realize they are not who we are, but passing phenomena. This realization creates space to respond wisely instead of reacting blindly, to let go instead of clinging, to forgive instead of holding on to old wounds. Understanding our past lives can accelerate this process. By seeing patterns that repeat across lifetimes, we gain perspective on how deeply habits of mind run and how essential it is to break them. We learn that the conditions we face now are not random, but opportunities to transform ancient tendencies. A moment of kindness today might untangle anger rooted in countless past experiences. A single act of generosity can plant seeds of joy that blossom beyond this lifetime. Ultimately, the purpose of spiritual practice is not to escape the world, but to engage it with a heart free from fear and a mind unclouded by delusion. Liberation means realizing we are not prisoners of our karma, but active participants in its transformation. It means awakening to the truth that consciousness itself, when purified of ignorance, is boundless, luminous, and free. The Buddha compared awakening to realizing that a house you thought you were trapped in was never locked, that the door has always been open. The stories of our past lives, then, are not chains to bind us, but mirrors showing where we've come from and how far we can go. They remind us that while we have wandered through countless existences, every moment in this life offers the chance to wake up, to step off the wheel of samsara, and to taste the peace of liberation. And that, above all, is the highest purpose: to live with such wisdom and compassion that we no longer spin helplessly through birth and death, but instead find the unshakable freedom that was within us all along. As we reach the end of this journey through time, one truth shines clearly: you are more than the sum of your memories in this single life. Beneath the stories of who you have been lies a timeless awareness, vast, compassionate, and unbreakable. Remembering past lives isn't about clinging to old identities or romanticizing the past. It's an invitation to see yourself and others with a wider lens, to live this life with greater purpose, to forgive more easily, to love more deeply, and to walk each step with awareness of the long, beautiful journey that led you here. Every echo from a past life, every unexplained longing, every sudden moment of recognition is a quiet call to remember your true nature, boundless, luminous, and free. Let these memories, whether clear or fleeting, inspire you not to dwell in old patterns, but to create new ones rooted in wisdom and compassion. In this way, the stories of many lifetimes can guide you toward a life of peace, kindness, and profound awakening. Know that you are never alone in this path. The countless lives you have lived, the lessons you have learned, and the connections you have made have all shaped the person you are today. And with each breath, you have the power to choose love over fear, presence over distraction, and liberation over the endless turning of samsara. If these reflections resonated with you, and you wish to continue exploring the timeless wisdom of Buddhism in a way that speaks to your heart, I invite you to subscribe to Zen Buddhism Wisdom. Join our community as we share teachings, stories, and practices to help you live with greater peace and purpose. Remember to like this video and hit the bell icon so you never miss a chance to journey deeper into the beauty of your own mind and spirit. Thank you for walking this path with us today. May you find peace in every step, and may your awareness continue to bloom like a lotus rising above the waters of time.